All right, 7 o'clock. Good evening, everyone. My name is Liz Colby, and you are at a Practical Farmers of Iowa Farminar on whole farm revenue protection. Tonight for you, we have Jeff Schahczenski from the National Center for Appropriate Technology. He's an agricultural economist there and is where is his title? There it is, Agricultural Policy and Funding Research Director for NCAT. We also have Tony Thompson joining us tonight, who's a beginning farmer near Elkhart, Iowa. He also serves on the board of the Iowa Farmers Union and the Iowa Food Co-op. And I'm just going to go through a few slides about PFI before we get started with that. Practical Farmers of Iowa. Oh, first I'm going to tell you some more about our Farminar series. This is the first Farminar in the Winter Farminar series. If you missed the Fall Farminar series, they are all archived on our website in the Farminar archive, so definitely go and check those out. They're every Tuesday, 7 o'clock p.m. right here, free to attend, so join in for all of them. As I was saying, Practical Farmers of Iowa was founded in 1985 by farmers, and we continue to be a farmer-led organization with about 2,800 members, mostly in the state of Iowa. Our mission is to strengthen farms and communities through farmer-led investigation and information sharing. Webinars like this, we offer free for anyone to see live or the recordings. And that's one thing we do. We have about 100 events every year, including our annual conference coming up in the next week, which I would encourage all of you to attend as well. We have a diverse membership of fruit and vegetable farmers, row crop farmers, livestock farmers, and friends of farmers as well, that span the whole conventional to organic spectrum. Very inexpensive to join, but you can attend many of our events for free. You do get a great discount at the annual conference if you're a member. You can also get a sign put up on your farm showing that you are a Practical Farmer of Iowa, and you can be invited to some of our regional potlucks and get discounts on other workshops and things we do throughout the year. We have all of our upcoming events on our website on this great calendar, so definitely go check that out. In addition to our events on there, we put up other agricultural events taking place in Iowa and around the Midwest that you might be interested in, so definitely use that as a resource. And another plug for our annual conference, January 23rd and 24th. We have, I think 60 different speakers that are coming for this, so it should be a really great couple of days, and we're expecting about 800 or 900 people. So hope to see you there. We do have a couple rules for the Farminar. First, you see that there's a chat box in the lower left-hand corner. And if you have questions, go ahead and type them in there. We are reserving the last 30 minutes for questions. So there might be one that pops up and Jeff or Tony will say that we should talk about that now, and they'll talk about it right then. Otherwise, put it in there and I'll be sure they get back to it at the end. Or when we get to that 30-minute question and answer period, you can just start typing them then. But anytime, go ahead and put something in the chat box. And again, the recording is available on our website, practicalfarmers.org/Farminar. And you'll notice that the attendees in the chat box participants don't have the capability to use a microphone. So yep, use that chat box as freely and as often as you would like. And those are all the rules I have. So I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Jeff and Tony.
Hello?
You sound good.
All right. Well, hello everyone. I am sitting in Butte, Montana. It's hard to believe that I'm so far away from Iowa. And it's actually, I just checked, it's a little warmer here than it is in Iowa, so that's actually unusual. My name is Jeff Schahczenski, and I'm, as Liz said, I'm with the National Center for Appropriate Technology. And I've been studying whole farm revenue for too many years, probably about 8 years now. I've been very interested in this topic. I work for the National Center for Appropriate Technology, which is a fairly old nonprofit, started in 1976, has a broad mission It has a very interesting history. The appropriate technology harkens back to some early days in the 70s when we were concerned with energy and some other issues, renewable energies in the first gas crisis. But now we have low gas prices, so maybe that's all over, huh? Anyway, another thing that we're known for, and many people often mix this up a little bit, is that we run for the USDA a USDA-funded project called ATRA, which is Appropriate Technology Transfer for Rural Areas, or we like to brand ourselves as the National Sustainable Ag Information Service. We've been around for quite a while, pre-social media days, so we still have the old 1-800 number, and we take calls from all over the country every single day, 5 days a week, 10 hours a day, from farmers interested in sustainable ag information. And we are really proud of this program, and we have over 300 some publications, and I hope some of you have had the chance to check us out and look at our background. So my interest in this, and I guess, Tony, if you feel like you need to get in there and ask me questions as we're going on. But my motivation and my interest and actually some of the reasons we got started in a project related to this had to do with a type of product I'll explain later called Adjusted Gross Revenue-Lite. And what was interesting about it is that we, of course, are interested in sustainable agriculture, and more it's seeming that with climate change and some other interesting research being done, that resilient systems tend to be diverse systems. And from the perspective of insurance tends to be crop and individual based, and so we tend to reinforce the crops that we grow rather than necessarily diversify our cropping systems. And RMA, a long time ago, around 2003, actually some early, decided that they would try to find a way, and this is a very hard thing to do, to provide a revenue-based insurance for a diverse cropping system. And that was the beginning of that project. And we, in 2007, undertook a project with the Risk Management Agency to try to improve that product, and we've done quite a bit on that. So what I'm going to talk about now is a little bit. I'm going to go back a little bit with the history, and basically tell how whole farm revenue, the whole farm revenue product is different than other kinds of federal crop insurance. Now, one thing that's interesting is that this is the first time a whole farm revenue type of product has ever been in Iowa, and it really is very, very new. We really didn't even have the policy handbook or knew exactly what this policy would be until late November of last year. And so it's, with the holidays and with a new thing, it's very, very new, and it's very new to Iowa. So it's never been in Iowa before. And it has been in other states. Whole farms have been in other states before, but it's very, very new to Iowa. So I'll also talk about the difference from other products, and I'll go through some basics of how it works. It's a little bit complicated, and then I'll give some examples from Iowa, and then we'll hopefully certainly have plenty of time for questions. As a background, in the United States, there's been a strong movement, and this is true in Iowa, and Iowa demonstrates it by this slide, as that farmers tend to be moving towards crop-based insurance, and they tend to be moving towards revenue protection. There are two major there's a revenue protection policy, and there's a revenue protection with harvest price exclusion. I won't get into the details of that, but you can see in Iowa that really, I'll use my pointer here, is that you still have people who are buying yield policies, which is really basically protecting a farmer against the losses of these, what we call multiple perils. And then we have, as you can see, a lot more policies now in 2014 that are just pure revenue protection. And if you look at here, is the total number of policies down here, you can see that revenue protection dominates. And of course, I'm originally from Wisconsin, so I know there's a lot of corn and soybeans grown in Iowa, and I would guess that a lot of these revenue protections have to do with policies for protecting corn and soybeans. So as I was saying, we got involved in a project in 2007, and it was around basically a product called Adjusted Gross Revenue-Lite. And it was a first whole farm policy, and as I said before, it was trying to serve a section of agriculture that hadn't really been served well with crop insurance. That highly diverse farm or somewhat diverse farms that do specialty crops, farms that really have a mixture and a diversification of the crops they grow. A lot of people, it was somewhat for the horticulture operations, but it really, we have people using Adjusted Gross Revenue-Lite here in Montana, even where we have organic and fairly diverse farms, specialty grain farms, for instance, have been using this product. But it was never really well used. And so we have this project where we actually created a wizard, and this wizard is still available, and you can click that or just Google AGLite wizard. And actually, as I get through this, if you want to go back to it later, I think it's well worth, even though now whole farm revenue, the whole farm revenue product is basically subsumed, is now the only product available, and AGR-Lite and AGR have gone away. They're basically based on the same thing. So the tool is very farmer friendly. I'm very proud of the tool, and it's a good way to explore whole farm revenue, even though you can't really access information from Iowa, because this product and this insurance was never available in Iowa. Although it's interesting, Minnesota and Wisconsin, your nearest neighbors, have always had it, and there's a long history and story that I don't really know the full details of why it was never set up in Iowa to begin with, but it isn't, but now it is. So that's a big change. So AGR-Lite had some problems. In fact, our project and some other projects that were going on at the time discovered why it wasn't being used. It was never used that much. It was used in many states, but it never really got used that well. And our project in part was not only creating the wizard, but to explain why it wasn't being used. Coverage was limited, and basically one way to think of this was a very high deductible product. What it meant is that essentially what it does, and this is true for whole farm, is it takes your average historical revenue and it insures a percentage of your historic revenue. So it isn't, again, I probably say this many times, it isn't insuring specific crops, it's actually insuring some part of your historic revenue. But AGR-Lite only protected about 72% of your historic revenue, meaning that one would have to have across the farm loss in revenue of 28% before they would see a premium. Very much like when you have a high deductible policy for an automobile where you break your windshield, but if you have a $500 or $1,000 deductible, you don't get anything from your insurance company. Well, farmers thought that's pretty, why should I buy an insurance where I am not likely to get a payment because I don't think I'll ever have that much of a loss. The premium subsidy, the subsidization of the premium cost, was not as good as it was for individual policies. And expanding operations that were rapidly expanding because it was based on historic revenue weren't handled as well. And that actually is a problem we'll return to in this talk. It was somewhat complicated, but our AGR-Lite wizard actually made that easier. So there's some paperwork, but largely the paperwork is the responsibility of your crop insurance agent. You have to provide them with information, but they can fill out all the paperwork for you as well. And it wasn't always available in many states. So interestingly, the 2014 Farm Bill, the Farm Bill that almost didn't happen, it was a very long process, as you recall, in finally settling on the 2014 Farm Bill. And the National Sustainable Ag Coalition, who we are members of, we're working very hard to try to improve whole farm revenue, and we kind of got lucky. We got the interest of RMA, we got the interest of some senators, Senator Stabenow, for instance, who was then chair of the Senate Ag Committee, and lives in a state, Michigan, which has a high diversity, a lot of farms with high diversity of crops, and crops that aren't always covered by other insurance policies. And we got their attention, and actually it's very interesting. This is the final language from the Farm Bill that has to do with whole farm revenue, and it basically says that RMA by 2016 should create one with a certain level of at least a liability limitation of 1,500,000, and we'll actually know that that's changed. And it was a very interesting story, but which I don't have that much time to go into, but really what happened was is that RMA worked with a number of people, like us included, and we basically worked early to actually fulfill the requirements of the Farm Bill almost before it was passed, not quite before it was passed, but, and so the actual product was being developed as the Farm Bill, and then it became clear that it was going to be available. So it was a very interesting history. And this is Brandon Willis, who's the current head of the Risk Management Agency in the Federal Crop Insurance. He serves on the Federal Crop Insurance Corporation Board, and he has basically been going around, and he's been very helpful in promoting this program. And I have there highlighted to expand options for specialty crops, organic and diversified crop producers, allowing them to insure all the crops at once instead of one commodity at a time. And that's actually a pretty good summary of the difference and distinctiveness of whole farm. So in some ways too, this is how Iowa arrived in Iowa, is before 2014, before we created whole farm, there were these two, as I said. There was AGR, which was a very similar to, let me get my pointer here. So you have, my pointer, I can't get it. There it is, okay. So you had very few counties where AGR, and AGR is very much like AGR-Lite, except it's had a higher level of coverage, but it was very limited in its access, whereas AGR-Lite down here was in several states, but obviously, in Iowa being one of them, missing. And then when we created the new pilot, and this, by the way, is a pilot insurance policy, and what that means is that it's in its first year, and there's lots of opportunity to fix and change and make it better. But it is essentially based on these programs, and then it was expanded to these states. Now there's hope and some degree of assertion that they will ultimately get to these states. There's still some major agricultural states that do not have it, and there you can see some counties in California that still don't have them, although there are some that do. So that's kind of interesting. It's still somewhat under development. So why might farmers want whole farm revenue? And this is the same for everywhere. Here, I'll get this out of the way here. So why might farmers want? First of all, it's there are many crops that are not insurable under a yield or a revenue insurance policy. It's an interesting thing, but for instance, nowhere in the United States can you buy a crop insurance policy for the production of carrots. So if you want to specialize in carrots and be a special carrot producer, you would have a hard time finding, you would not be able to find any federally subsidized crop insurance. I think perhaps privately, if you can almost insure anything if you at a price, but there's really no crop insurance for carrots in the United States. But you can actually, so I actually contradicted myself, because you could cover carrots under the whole farm policy, because the whole farm revenue policy essentially covers revenue. It doesn't cover a specific crop. And so you have to keep thinking very differently here. You have to keep thinking in terms of protecting revenue and not protecting a specific crop or insuring a specific crop. If you have a commodity that has, for instance, premium prices because it's a specialized product, that to the extent that you grow that historically over years, that becomes embedded in your historic revenue, and therefore it covers it. This is true of organic and other specialty crops. Organic farmers for many years used to have to pay surcharges, and still to this day on many crops cannot insure them easily for their organic value. However, it was always true that whole farm and AGR-Lite that preceded it could actually cover organic farms because, again, to the extent that you were going organically and the organic prices were reflected in your revenue, you were able to actually protect that revenue that was related to the higher price related to of growing that organically. Quality losses, so if you have a loss that has to do with you lose because you suddenly change that again, that would be reflected in a loss of revenue, and it would be compensated for. And the other interesting thing about whole farm revenue, although there's limitations that have changed from AGR-Lite, is that it is inclusive of livestock products. Again, think farms that are diversified in crops and livestock. Think of protecting whole farm revenue, not specific crops. So here are the basic outlines, some characteristics. It has a liability limit. Let me get my little pointer here again. There is a liability limit of 8.5 million, which means if your farm generates a revenue or an historic revenue over 8.5, or in the year that you're going to insure you have 8.5 million or more, you essentially will not be able to cover it. This is a big thing, and I'll speak to this a little bit more later, is that you basically, the level of coverage has gone up. Remember when I said the effective coverage of 72%? Well, now we're up at 85% coverage of that. And you can, and with like all other crop insurance policies, you can actually choose the level of coverage anywhere from 50% of your historic revenue up to 85%. But you can only get the higher level of coverages of 80 and 85% if you produce 3 commodities or more. And we'll speak more about commodities, which is an issue. You're not eligible for simply for a one commodity. You're not eligible unless, and actually so if you were growing some strange commodity that was only when you were growing, maybe carrots, here's carrots. If there was no commodity and there's no other product for it, you could actually sue. So here you go. If you wanted to be a specialized carrot grower, you could actually do this because there aren't any other, as I said, there aren't other policies that cover carrots. There are, as I was saying, you can, again, livestock's included, but there's a 35% of your expected revenue in the year you insure, or up to $1 million max. You can, if you have over that, then it won't work for the livestock. And if you have a nursery or a greenhouse, there's also the same limitation. This is new to whole farm. This was not an AGR-Lite or AGR-Li, but there's also a pre-plant. So a replant, if you had a planting failure up to a certain limit, 20% of the expected revenue, or 20 acres, or 20% of the crop needing to be replanted. So it says limits, but there's some immediate coverage of that. And this is very important. It can also be mixed and matched with others. So you potentially could, for instance, grow soybeans, be growing a specialty crop, several other specialty crops, and this is somewhat the example we'll get into, and you could actually cover one policy with revenue soybean product, and then all the rest of the farm under a whole farm policy. You can't, however, mix and match with a catastrophic. Catastrophic is basically the minimal insurance one can take on a specific crop. If you have that, you can't combine a catastrophic policy and this policy. Okay, so more. This market readiness I'll probably come back to later. Basically, there was always an issue about value added. Whole farm and AGR-Lite that preceded only wants to be basically ensuring the value of the product as it literally is produced in the field and made market ready, but it isn't going to. So in other words, it will. If you were growing apples, it will cover apples, but it won't cover applesauce. In other words, if you have an on-farm ability to make applesauce or apple cider, you basically have to pull out those expenses and income that relate to the applesauce part, and basically you can ensure the apple production at its apple value. So it's a bit sticky there, but in many cases it's not a huge issue. Again, they added an extra feature which somewhat complicates it, but basically saying that if your farm tends to be moving up very rapidly in expansion mode, is expanding, you can see that quickly that if you started at a very low level of revenue and you started going very fast, then your average isn't really reflecting where you're at today. It could lead possibly to underinsurement, being underinsured. These are just some sales closing date, and so for this year, if you're going to start exploring and buying, you need to buy it by, in the case of Iowa, that's 3/15. So you need to do it. And the rating means how the premiums are calculated. It's basically the same as the way the risk factors that go into actually calculating the premium costs are almost identical to AGR and AGR-Lite. And that's why that tool I was talking about, the AGR-Lite Wizard, can be somewhat helpful. There is also online, and it's in our primer that came along with this, a place where you can actually you can go in there and you can actually calculate the premium, which I did for many of the examples here. I wanted to stress this too: the coverage and support has increased. This is this is kind of a big win for us in terms of the politics and trying to get into the Farm Bill, that we increased the coverage to 85%. Because, as we said before, we thought that no one was using this product because they were basically stuck at the 70%. And we kind of made the argument that if you're going to provide 85% coverage level for corn, field corn, for instance, then why shouldn't you provide the same level of coverage for somebody who is diversified? So as you can see, these are different units. I don't know how many people are corn and soybean farmers on this call, but if you're very familiar with the crop insurance, you can actually insure at different levels. Basically what it is that you can divide your farm into very small units, basic units, in which case you pay a little bit, you don't get quite as much subsidy, and you pay a little bit more for premiums, but then you can basically play games where, like, if one crop fails in one field, you can cover that even if you have an excess in another field. And so there's a lot of different coverages level, but as you can see, there's also a level under a crop insurance where a single crop policy like corn, where you can actually combine the crops. And so this is very similar. This whole farm unit that can be bought under crop insurance is very similar to whole farm revenue. And basically this is the level of subsidization. So you can see that until you get to the 80 and 85%, basically the taxpayer dollars are paying for and subsidizing the cost. So the cost has become more reasonable and the level of coverage has increased. So how does it work? Basically, you have to complete first a whole farm history report, and I'll give an example, and it's using 5 years of consecutive tax year for information. Generally, that's a Schedule F. For most farms in the country, you file your taxes on a Schedule F. And basically all the information that determines your historic average comes from those records. Then you have to actually do what you're going to do for the year you're going to insure. You have to fill out what you call an intended production year, and basically you are insuring at one of those numbers, depending, it's really the lower of the two, and essentially loss occurs when you basically, if your farm in the year that you're insured drops below that is approved historic revenue, you essentially get bumped back up, or 85% of it, because that's the maximum you can get. You could get bumped back up to that 85% level if you took the highest level of coverage. So here's an example of the whole farm. This is the actual form that would be used. So this is a fairly large farm, $6 million operation, and you can see through these. So this is their first year buying the product, and they have the data from. This is their basically taken right off of their Right here, this is taken right off their Schedule Fs. These numbers come right off your Schedule Fs, these expenses. I'll explain why expenses are tracked later. But you come up with then a total over the 5 years. We skip 2014 because many people haven't yet, and this is the first year, hasn't yet, since this is the first year, they haven't yet filed their taxes, so they don't use the number for 2014 for purchasing the product in 2015. And so you get this simple average, which is just the total divided by the numbers. And now you have these two, which are somewhat confusing, but they're basically trying to get at an expanding operation. And I have another slide that'll explain this a little bit better. But it's basically, they're just taking this simple average and giving you a little bit benefit of the doubt as you expand. Now, expanding operations under the new whole farm gives you basically a 10% bump up in your historic average revenue, which then gives you potentially a higher level of coverage. But the expanded operation has to be agreed by your insurance company that you truly are an expanding operation, that you actually can kind of document that you've added acreage or you're adding increased values. So basically, this is the number that becomes important. It's the higher of these three numbers in determining ultimately the premium. Now, as I said, you have to then also say, well, what's my production going to be in the year of my insurance? And this is this example here. I know it's fairly small, but we have sweet corn, 2 different kinds of apples, potatoes. I keep forgetting to use the pointer. We have sweet corn, potatoes, 2 different kinds of apple. Note they have the same commodity number, potatoes, hay, alfalfa. So a fairly interesting diversified farm. And this is their yield, their expected price. And they come out with expecting that they're going to do $6,580,000 worth of revenue is going to be generated. So that's their total expected revenue. Now from the other one, remember we had the 7,000, and now basically you take the lower of those two. I have one more slide that probably shows this even better than this thing. Now then there's another new wrinkle in the whole farm that wasn't true in AGR-Lite and the other previous whole farms. So you and Iowa are getting the benefit of this benefit, or maybe complication. But right here we have a revised report. So by July 15, so you put this out first, and it will determine this thing. But you also then have to do another report at the end, and then when you're finally done, you actually put this, and that's how you calculate your indemnity. But you do this revised report, and now here what happened was that the farmer intended to originally to grow. How many acres was there? 620 acres of potatoes, and something happened, and by July 15 it ended up only with 500. And so in a way, and that then readjusts your whole farm revenue and recalculates. So now that could be to your advantage, or in a sense you want to report as accurate as possible your whole farm's revenue, and also you might actually end up having planted more acres, and therefore you can actually make sure you get it covered. So there's some advantages, but it does add complications in another report to file by a certain date. So here's maybe a simpler way. So we have the historic average here. We have this calculated index, which really is taking these kind of last 2 years and comparing it to the average and kind of bumping it up, and so it's a little higher. And then you have this thing by multiplying simply the expected expanded operation thing by 1.1, so it gets a little higher. So you get the higher of these two, but your expected is only here, so really it takes the lower of this. Obviously they're not going to insure you for your higher approved expected revenue if you're only intending to do this. And then you basically come down here, you have this approved revenue, so that's approved by your insurance agent. Let's say he takes the highest level of coverage. This becomes this number right here becomes the all-important number. So you got your approved revenue, the revenue, and then you got this insured revenue right here, and this is the all-important number that basically this is what you're insured for, up to that's 85% of that approved revenue. So let's go forward here. So the premium is calculated, and it's very dependent on a number of things: the counties where you live, The commodities grown can make a difference. Obviously, not all commodities are equal risk and growing. Percentage of commodity grown, so it depends on how much you're growing within the many crops you might grow, and the commodity count. And we'll explain some of the issues and problems with the commodity count, but basically that's the number of significant products you have. And the more you have, the lower the premium. And basically that is because of the idea of putting all your eggs in one basket. So if you have less, if you have more, there's less risk, and so the premium cost is lower. So an indemnity payment, again, the 85. So let's say that in that crop year, there was somewhat of a failure that either had to do with price or had to do with yield or a multiple peril, and the farmer ended up only with $4 million in revenue to count, and basically the indemnity payment would be the difference. So he would be bumped up. So this is the guarantee. So right here is the guarantee. Right here is the guarantee. You had that loss, you get an indemnity payment that moves you up to there. And claims, this is all true of all crop insurance. If you have something that affects a crop that's going to affect your revenue, report it. It's always good to do under any crop insurance policy as soon as possible. Formal claim has to be done maybe not later than 60 days after the original date of your farm tax forms for the insurance. And then there's an adjustment. This is why the expenses are important. It's kind of a check to make sure that there wasn't an intentional moral hazard, as they call, or you're intentionally trying to game the system. They do check to see that you actually did spend some you did have some expenses, and you did in fact. So if you go under 70% of your historic expenses for the same farm, then there will be some checking into that and some adjustment of your indemnity payment. So let's go to Tony now. Tony gave me these examples, and I know they're relatively real and could be possible. It is a case, and so we have a case of, this is a simple case where we're basically having a farm you would think would be very popular. We have some tomatoes, cucumbers, sweet corn, pumpkin, squash, and we have this revenue that was historically over the whole time. Again, 2014 not used. The simple average is there. This is the index. They didn't take the expanded option in this case because they didn't think they would essentially meet the requirement of an expanded option. And they have down here the expected revenue, which tends to be lower both in the indexed and the simple average. So essentially, you take the higher of these two, which is that, and then the lower of these two, which is this. So this is, again, the level of which the indemnification. So 85% of that is going to be protected by the policy if he takes the highest level of coverage. Now, Tony gave me another example where he wanted to combine, let's say a farmer was going on and had a corn soybean operation going on, and he wanted to try to combine, and he wanted to get into horticultural crops on the side. So he's got a combined revenue here and so again, this is doable under whole farm. You could actually include you could either get these separate policies, as I said, mix and match, and then whole farm for the rest. Whole farm, mix and match for regular revenue policies for these two crops, mix and match, and then get the whole farm for this one, or you could combine them all together. And again, you have a simple average of the combined, and again, you're down here, it's 304,000. The higher of these three is the 330, and yet this is 340. So again, the indemnification, the indemnity, the premium is based you're on the coverage of 85 if you take the highest level of that. So these are the two cases. And now I'm going to quickly look at the premium cost, and you're going to be surprised. And you're going to find it, and we're going to explain this somewhat similar. Now, as I recalled, one of the basic things is that you had to have 3 commodities to get the higher level of coverage. And you can see not available, not available. And the reason is, and it's very bizarre, but in Iowa, and this is actually something that came out of this project, and we are actually discussing with RMA as we speak in this last few weeks, because we discovered this, is that in Iowa, not all there, since Iowa had not had a history of whole farm revenue, the RMA didn't feel they had enough data on many of the horticultural crops that potentially could be grown in Iowa. And so what they do is they have a category called other vegetables. And interestingly, Tony picked 5 vegetables that aren't available as unique vegetables on the list of commodities that are insurable under whole farm, which means he essentially in scenario 1, which is just without the corn and soybeans, he essentially has one other vegetable category. And other vegetable categories, and this is true, what's true of AGR-Lite, means that they have no data or not very good data, and therefore the risk of growing those is perceived to be higher. And what you see, that even at the 75% level with one commodity, it's a fairly high level of premium for protecting those crops. But interestingly, if you combine with the soybeans, then you have 3 commodities, and so you actually can get the highest level of coverage for the 3 commodities, but this is covering 3. But interestingly, here, even then, you can, at the 75%, the premium has dropped. Now, this is somewhat of an anomaly. This is fairly unique to Iowa as far as we know right now. And again, I said this is a very new program, so we are still, as they say, and it's a pilot. So hopefully maybe by 2015, but probably by 2016, I think we'll be able to expand the list of commodities that are insurable under this product. And and another issue is, as I said, is the rapidly expanding operation challenge. Now, this is a somewhat different scenario, but we again have the simple average, we have the indexed, and we have the expanded operation average here. And again, the highest of these is this expanded, but this one, as you can see, what was happening. The farmer suddenly jumped in 2014. He like doubled his revenue, and he's expecting to at least be at that same revenue down here. So again, but but remember, it's on the historic revenue, the lower of the two. So again, the indemnification is going to be there. So you can take this both ways. Now, if there's a legitimate expansion and this farmer is expecting to make $216,000, but he can only get 85% of this indexed average, he may be underinsured. So this is another issue. If the farm is rapidly expanding, it may not be as easy to get the level of coverage that one might want. And this data and commodity count challenge is particularly unique, and I just wanted to show you. I took the same scenario 1, and these are the same numbers, premium costs that went across Iowa, and again, not available because there's only really one commodity, the other vegetable. I took the same farm in Wisconsin, in Dane County, Wisconsin, near where I grew up, and you can see that at the same level, it's almost 8 times less premium, because on the list, the commodities that are available under the whole farm revenue protection in Wisconsin are much larger. The list is much longer. And this may be part of a historical phenomenon because, again, as I said, Wisconsin and Minnesota both have had whole farm, they had AGR-Lite, they had formula products for a long time, and the data was much better, at least according to RMA, so that they could offer a wider selection of commodities under which to insure. So there's an issue right now in Iowa around this topic. These are very small, but this is the list of the commodities that are available under whole farms, and it's quite extensive. But you can see a lot of crops that would be potentially growable in Iowa are not there. But you do have these other categories. But again, the other categories automatically make the premium higher because they're generally conceived of as higher risk. And then you can see there's poultry and there's some other. So even without the change, there certainly are some mixes of crops that could benefit under whole farm. So in summary, there are many opportunities. For the first time in Iowa, farmers have the ability to insure whole farm revenue. This was never before possible, and it's very new. And as I said, we're still working on some of the issues around it. But from my perspective of sustainability, it tends to turn the idea over to the idea that farmers should try to think about how they might be most profitable by the mix of crops and livestock that will give them the greatest level of profitability, and then this insurance will protect your revenue rather than a specific crop. So the potential of this idea is one, to promote diversity, not necessarily to promote the continued growing of single or a couple different crops, which with very good insurance tends to be the incentive. First time you ever can protect crops and livestock products in the same policy together. There are some livestock products that are separate, but this one puts them together. The level of coverage is available is higher than it's ever been before for whole farm, so it's equivalent to a single crop, and depending on the value and number of products grown, the cost of insurance may be lower. So if you can think of a farm, even corn and soybean farms, but let's say you're going to go beyond corn and soybeans and other specialty grains, other things that you can't get insurance for other ways, you might for the first time be able to diversify your farm into new and novel innovative crops that you haven't had before. So it opens up exciting possibilities and takes some of the risk out of experimenting with new and higher valued crops. The challenges, as I said already, the lack of data on horticultural crops and livestock appears to be limiting the ability to increase the commodity count. Remember, the all-important commodity count, the more commodities you can insure, the lower the premium. So if you have to bundle all of the commodities together because they're just not available, then your premiums become higher. Like all crop insurance, it does require good record keeping because you have to basically say what every crop you grow is and what the price is expected. You have to go through that policy, which is pretty much the same for other ones. There's this mid-policy revision, which can be good or bad. It does add paperwork. It's not for beginning farmers, at least beginning farmers that haven't been farming more than 6 years. 2009, for this year, you have to have records, Schedule Fs going back to 2009. Again, the whole issue of very rapidly expanding farms may cause some underinsurance. And if you have very, very high levels of diversity, I know Tony, speaking of this as a CSA, just think of that intended production. You have to list, and if you have 60 and 70 crops, you're going to not only have to keep good records of all of those so that you could make a claim, you're going to have to list them all out. But again, the insurance agents, it's not technically impossible, but it certainly is possible. And I'm finished, and I know maybe that took a bit longer. I tried to go a little slower, but I think we still have over a half an hour worth of questions, and I'll have Tony talk for a while first, and maybe we'll do some interaction. Sorry for monopolizing all the time. Tony?
Well, thanks, Jeff. I'm glad that you monopolized the time because you've got the expertise here. And as a beginning farmer myself, let me just say a few things about where I'm coming from. So I grew up on a farm that has 250 acres of row crops. Jeff, would you mute your mic while I talk for a couple minutes?
Yep.
My farm has 250 acres of row crops. My mom sharecrops that then with some other farmers. So it's around and it's on my mind, but it's not really what I consider my own operation. And then my own operation then is 3 acres of vegetables that I grow for a CSA. And as I look forward, I'm looking for some wholesale opportunities. So if I summarize or if I think about Jeff's presentation from my standpoint, what I see is that whole farm revenue protection, first of all, it's not for beginning farmers, partly because it requires 5 years of data, but also because our operations are typically expanding quickly. I know for myself, I'll try and quadruple my revenue from my first year to my second year. So the insurance just wouldn't be very helpful with that, even if I had historical data. And then from a CSA standpoint, it's probably also not for CSAs because there are too many crops. So I've got 35 or 40 different vegetable crops grown for my CSA. It's simply too difficult to try to tie revenue to a specific crop for other reasons. So this whole farm revenue idea, it's still crop-based, right? It's not really revenue-based. It's still crop-based, which is an interesting thing in terms of the added value. So Jeff mentioned applesauce as a product cannot be insured through this, but the apples can be. I'm actually wondering maybe there's an opportunity to insure crops through the CSA in a similar mentality where a farm would internally raise crops wholesale, sell to the CSA enterprise under the same farm, and have that insured that way. And then the CSA aspect, the value added aspect, is insured through CSA customers. I will have to think more about that. A question that I have that I haven't explored, and I don't think Jeff has explored it, is are the CSAs in Dane County, Wisconsin able to use the whole farm revenue protection? Jeff, you dropped off. I don't know if Jeff has an answer for that or not. The whole farm revenue protection certainly does reward diversity. So the three commodities that allows going up to that 85% coverage level, it's very much worth noting, as Jeff said. If there's only one or two commodities, of course, it's limited to 75%. Scenario 1 versus scenario 2. So my situation here in Iowa that Jeff was talking about, just to emphasize that, again, that's be addressed hopefully by RMA in the future. I did want to note that on the expanded operations slide, there was a hogs enterprise with a gross revenue of only $4,000. Let's see if we can go back to that slide real quick. And I wanted to point out that with a new operation like this, a new enterprise like this, there is a minimum qualifying amount to be considered a commodity, and that $4,000 for the hogs didn't meet that. And Jeff, here's a question for you. What is that minimum qualifying amount? I remember maybe we just say that it's complicated now, but could you say a couple things about minimum qualification?
And Jeff, you may need to restart your audio up top. Just click connect audio again.
Can you hear me now? Hello?
Yes, I can.
Oh, sorry. I guess, yeah, but something faded out there for a bit.
Oh, you were there, Jeff, and then you went away.
Jeff, did you hear Tony's question about the hogs?
Hello.
You're good.
I'm good. I'm sorry. I think something keeps happening to my mic a little bit here. The idea of the hogs is, yes, if you think about it from another perspective, if a farmer were to only grow two commodities and then they grow a tiny bit of something and they wanted to count that as three commodities, that level of diversification in the premium reduction that would result it would be a little bit like I think RMA was kind of thinking of a way to not to prevent such a kind of way to use the system, to basically get a lower premium by growing a very small amount of crop or even a livestock product. So what they did is they have a really complicated formula, which luckily the cost estimator automatically does for you, and it basically proportions out as if proportions relative to the gross revenue produces. It basically comes up with a number, and if you don't meet that certain basically minimum proportion, it is fairly low, but in this case the hogs didn't make it, then it doesn't count as a commodity. I could have gone through a very mathematical explanation of exactly how that goes on, how it's actually calculated, but basically just think of it as it's a kind of a minimal proportion of the total revenue has to be covered by every commodity that counts towards that, because as we know it's related to a premium reduction, and that's very valuable. So it's kind of it's a wash there. What was the other question you asked, Tony? I forgot.
Well, I'll move forward now.
Okay.
Next question is, do I really have to have 5 years of records? I mean, what if I have 3 years and use 0 as the first 2 years? Clearly, I'd bring that average down, and thus the level that I'm able to insure. But would that be allowed?
No, simply no. No, you have to have 5 actual years of production. Now, I'll tell you, in the debate when this was when we were actually, a number of us from around the country, actually Matt in Kansas, we proposed an idea to lower the, now you can think of it from RMA's perspective, they want to know that a farm has some capacity to generate the revenue that they're going to insure. And so they want to know that, a really early farmer would be high risk. So there's some idea that the 5 years, I think they're also thinking in terms of crop insurance based, single crop insurance policies, where you have to have an actual production history of 4 years, to establish a yield history, actual revenue history they call it, an actual basically, which is the guarantee for your revenue. So they kind of modeled it on that, although we argued maybe make it 4 or make it 3 rather than 5, because that would bring beginning farmers in. And I think the other point you make, which is a very good one, and I'm not sure how to get around this, is that in 2 ways this might be a problem, particularly a problem for beginning farmers. As you state, beginning farmers tend to expand rapidly, and then they finally find themselves with the historic revenue to purchase the policy, and they're higher than their average. And this is kind of like yield, because often yield might start low when a farm's inexperienced, and they have to establish their historic yields upon which their revenue is based, and so they might all of a sudden have a really good yield year, and they still are only insured at their lower yield. So I think that people at RMA are kind of confusing the crop-based and the revenue-based, and it is a serious issue, and it really starts to speak to people that have stabilized income revenue, that have stable revenue over time and look to pretty much be stable, that are going to get the kind of optimal benefit out of the program.
Well, I guess that's where we hope diversified operations end up. I'm just not sure about getting them there.
Yeah, I agree.
So for me, practically now, in my second year as a CSA farmer, if I start using the possibility of a future whole farm revenue protection, so that, I'm going to start planning now so that 5 years from now, when I have my 5 years of records, well, I won't ask what level of confidence I can have that this program will exist. We'll skip that and just hope that it is consistent in future farm bills. But it seems like what I would want to do is to keep records in such a way that I can have that 5-year history for crops, looking back through 2014 through 2018, and have the records for those variety of vegetables that I might be interested in, especially wholesaling, so as to not worry about the value add aspect. Is there anything else that I should be thinking about right now in terms of the future of whole farm revenue protection as I'm getting started?
I think you make a very good point. Now, whether it's going to exist, into the future, it is a pilot program, which means, as I said before, a pilot has a very special category. We have the chance and opportunity in the next few years to improve this, and this is why it's good to have these discussions early, so we can try to improve this. And at some point, it will be made into a permanent program rather than just a pilot. And hopefully at that point, some of these issues can be addressed. I think if you're a farm that is always going to be really, really highly diverse, that in a CSA, and there are many that do, this may not ever be the policy for you. I think what this policy is really trying to address is a special niche. And this is seeming to happen is farms start off often as CSAs. It's a good way to start a market. Then they tend to say, well, I can't keep producing this variety and diversity. I think I'm going to go to wholesale markets. I'm going to maybe get down to 5, 6, 7 crops that I know are very valuable. And as that history unfolds, and there are farms that I've worked with who are at that point already, they can very much take advantage of this. The other people that are taking advantage of this already and did so with AGR-Lite are those who grow very specialized products. In Montana, for instance, we have organic specialty grain growers who grow triticale. They grow some very interesting corns, you wouldn't believe it, but that are high protein, that really are not insurable in any other way and are high value for them. And they have had histories of growing these specialty crops. So there's, I think, a whole genre of people who have maybe 4 or 5 different crops, have highly specialized crop. Seed producers is another. Sometimes people specialize in seed production of specific 4 or 5 different seeds. It's again another policy that this then. So as it stands now, there's a fairly good niche in the world out there, and we're not sure how big that niche is, that have been using it. We know that fruit growers in Washington have been using whole farm, in Washington State, have been using whole farm for years, and it probably is because they're growing 3 or 4 or 5 different kinds of specialty fruits that have very high value, that they've been growing, in 3 or 4, 5, 6, crops, and they're actually exposed to some serious price dynamics. Remember, this is revenue, so price changes can affect revenue as well as quantity, and also fruits can be exposed to lots of frost and freezes. So there are some farms where this is particularly useful, particularly also when there isn't individual policies available. And as many, we always see the list of all these insurable crops that IRMA has, but they're only available in very, very often in very few counties in the United States. Montana grows apples, but we don't have apple insurance in Montana, for instance. So whole farm is, again, another way to take care of that when you don't have another option.
So let me use this as a chance to transition over to participant questions, and we'll start with Ann's, and I'm going to expand on that a little bit to give it some context that I think could be relevant. But could it be useful for commodity crop farmers who want to start diversifying into a few new crops? And part of my question, Jeff, along with that is, do I need to break out revenue historically by crop? So if I historically have just been growing corn and soybeans, and I have my adjusted gross revenue for those combined, is it, if I add that third crop, if I add oats or alfalfa, do I need to have historical revenue for the oats and alfalfa, or can it just be for my whole farm, assuming that I'll substitute some of the acres that were in corn and soybeans into oats or alfalfa in the future?
No. It is based on the basically what you insure is on your historic. If you were growing corn and soybeans since 2009, then that would be the basis upon which you could buy a whole farm. I would not recommend, for instance, somebody buying corn and soybeans. Most farmers that are growing corn or soybeans have very good revenue insurance policies already. They're very, very, very good coverage. There's no sense in which a corn or soybean wouldn't take individual revenue. Now, when you add a third or a fourth crop, again, you have to have historically grown them. You can say your intended production is with these crops, and then therefore you can add those crops, and those crops become part of your intended production. But again, you're still basing it.
We lost Jeff. Jeff, if you lost your mic, or
Hello again. I'm sorry. For some reason, my mic just cuts out. So yes, I mean there is, but again, it's kind of like you have to play catch up to get the level of coverage. As you add more crops and you accumulate them, then essentially you would have to be a kind of an exercise of saying how much it would cost me to do corn and soybeans separately with separate policies versus how much would a premium cost if I add a third and fourth crop that might be higher value. So it requires kind of a slow movement into a new crops, and yeah, it does cover some percentage because your revenue is going to be more now dispersed amongst 4 crops rather than 2 across a given, let's say, given field, and therefore you would have some level of coverage for those new crops that you're potentially growing as added specialty crops that have high value and perhaps are not covered in any other way.
There's a new question here for us. How are organic farms eligible for these programs, and are there any specific challenges for an organic operation?
No, not at all. Organic farms are the advantage, of course, is that again, like AGR-Lite that preceded it, to the extent and you've been growing organically for several years, that value, that in most cases higher value, is embedded in your revenue. Therefore, it's one of the few products that actually can provide protection for that organic value. So no, it's actually it's one of its, in fact, in many ways, AGR-Lite was often used by organic farmers because it was one way to, again, capture that value of the organic. Now, there has been some changes recently, and I don't want to go into them because they're complicated themselves, and we might do that. We're going to do another webinar on this topic, and there's going to be several webinars coming up. I'm doing one nationally on next week and on the 21st at 3 o'clock Eastern Standard Time, and I'll give that to Liz or somebody to send it around if you want to hear more about this. But anyway, it really does serve the organic community well. There are some, like I say, some new ways in which you can deal with individual crops that are organic. There's price elections for a very few limited organic crops that are at their organic value for individual policies, and there's something called the contract price addendum that with a contracted organic price for only a few crops, you can actually insure it to some percentage of your contracted price. But those are very new as well, and again are crop-based and not whole farm-based.
There was one earlier question from Emma about where do we get the list of commodities that are covered in Iowa?
Yeah, I should have put that on my slide. There is, I can send anybody. I think you all have my email. If you don't, Ann can get it to you and others. There's a place where you can actually download it. I actually showed you the list that's the actual list, and that was downloaded. No, it's near the end. It's near. I think you're back. Yeah, the other way. Keep going. Keep going. It's pretty small print, but that's them. That page and the next page, and that's actually downloadable off of the RMA website. I can give you the link for it, and you can find the list in every state that's insurable under whole farm revenue. If you click the next page, you'll see the next set. Sure. So it's a very short list. It's much shorter than, like I said, Minnesota, Wisconsin. I've looked at Indiana. I haven't looked at them all yet, but and this is like I said, we've brought this to the attention of Iowa, and at this point, the statement I'm getting is that they don't have enough data to feel comfortable to offer more than these commodities under whole farm at the current time. But they're looking into it. We'll see.
Jeff, this might be a good time to point out the whole farm revenue primer PDF that it's available. So in the lower right-hand corner. Yeah,
it's a great overview of basically what I've done on this presentation, and it gives you the basics of everything. So please use that.
And then Ann is asking another question. How will RMA collect the data so that more crops can be counted for Iowa if now they're lumping so many crops together in the other category?
Good question, Ann. I don't know. It is curious to me. I must be frank. When AGR-Lite was created, and for Minnesota and Wisconsin, as I said, there was a story about that somehow Iowa didn't want to join into the project, and again, this is anecdotal information, but some people worked together and they started to collect this information, and apparently they were able to do pretty extensive lists for Minnesota and Wisconsin. And I have heard of a woman in Iowa State Extension who is also perhaps working on this. I find it kind of hard to believe that they could find this data for Wisconsin and Minnesota, and even Indiana, which is a new state, has more lists on it. So I'm not sure why that's happening. I'm not sure the level of data and the need to be, what they need to actually change it. I expect an answer to that, and I will share that with Ann, and Ann can share that with you when we find out more information about it. It's interesting. It's great we had this webinar, because I don't think we would have necessarily discovered if Tony hadn't given such a perfect example of the 5 crops that just weren't on the list. It was actually surprising to me as well, actually, because again, with AGR-Lite, I never ran into that problem. Now, I mean, obviously, you're not going to have oranges on the list in Iowa. I mean, there has to be some, there are some limitations. You're not going to offer somebody to try to, cover insurance for growing oranges in Iowa. But apples in Montana is a different thing.
Jeff, I'm out of questions, so unless we see anything from the chat box here in the next few seconds, I want to say thanks. It's been a very helpful process for me going through this and trying to wrap my mind around it as I dive into the crop insurance pool.
Yeah.
You want to talk a little bit about insurance agents and how people, if they were interested in this, should go about looking for someone or working with an agent?
Yes. There's a list, and I can again give you a link to it and it's on the RMA website of accredited insurance providers, which are all crop insurance advisors. I don't know. I assume, maybe I shouldn't assume, but crop insurance is, federal crop insurance is basically the terms and the way the policies run are determined by the government, but the actual sale and work of selling the policies are private companies. So there are many different crop insurance, and you shop around, and you should now. This is probably another issue, and this is why it probably will take time for whole farm to be fully utilized in Iowa, is that this is also new to private crop insurance agents. But under the way it works in the United States is that once a policy is provided, the accredited insurance agent has to provide it. So these policies are available in Iowa, and any insurance company has to sell them to you. They're going to be nervous because it's going to be, for many of them, the first time they ever wrote one of these policies up. But you can look in the phone book, but there's actually a good list that I can get you of all the insurance companies that operate in Iowa, and it'll be a learning process for all the folks involved. In fact, one of the things we learned from the AGR-Lite project that it makes insurance agents are very good at writing individual crop policies like corn and soy. They're very good at that, and they can do that quite well. When they get into these complex, a little bit more complex policies, they need to be there, and they have been being trained, but they've only recently been trained. So I heard, for instance, in Montana that there actually are a few folks that are actually going to take this on, a couple companies in Montana that are going to take this on as a specialty, kind of a specialty product line for their company, and they're going to learn it quite well because they see some potential.
Looks like Jeff dropped off again, the mic.
Yeah. Yep, I'm sorry, I drop off. I know what's happening is my screensaver shuts down and it shuts my mic off. I'm sorry. Is that, what's always impressed about me is that I think, I've been working on it many years, and we're getting closer, I think, now to getting better coverage, and trying to take care of hopefully the kind of agriculture we're moving to, greater diversity, greater complexity in our systems of agriculture so they can be more resilient. And it's relatively easy to write an insurance policy for corn or soybeans or for a single crop. it is hard to try to figure out how to do this, and we are still exploring alternative ways, and we're coming up with new ideas. But I think we're making progress so that we can have a kind of insurance that kind of incentivizes diversity and incentivizes and can help people take the chance and risk to try new things and innovative things that I think will ultimately lead to a more sustainable agriculture. That's my hope.
Okay, Liz, you're...
Yeah, so you've been going back and forth with Jeff on some different scenarios for your farm, and I'm curious how prepping for this Farm&R and looking at some different scenarios, has it changed or influenced your decision making for the future of your own farm and getting crop insurance?
I think it's going to make me look more intentionally about wholesale opportunities sooner rather than later. What I mean by that is my short-term plan is to continue with the CSA, but knowing that longer term, both because of the labor input and just lots of issues with CSAs, like Jeff was saying, if I want to move into wholesale down the road, I would like to be able to ensure that. So I'm going to start thinking more intentionally this year about what I can do to collect data in a way that will provide me with the historical data that I need in 2019 if I wanted to sign up for insurance. I do think there's also an interesting question for someone that has a few years of history from CSA growth or vegetable growth. In my situation where my mom is sharecropping land on the same farm in traditional row crops, and I'm wondering about the opportunity to combine the corn and soybean insurance with vegetable insurance of some sort, but it's not appropriate for me to do right now.
Like Anne has another.
Yeah, Liz, you're a bit hard to hear.
Oh, sorry.
Sean did have a question, Jeff, and I think I responded to it, but he was asking, is poultry just bird or eggs? My response was eggs were on that first crop list page in Iowa, and poultry on the second, assuming that poultry is meat. I wonder if there's any other commodities that we could comment on quickly. I know, for example, sweet corn. That was on my list, but it was for processing sweet corn, not for fresh market sweet corn.
Yeah, that's interesting because both of them are on the list in Wisconsin and Minnesota and Indiana, both as processing and as sweet market fresh, which they do have individual policies for both those types of sweet corn. So again, it's somewhat surprising to me, this list, but that's all I guess I can say is that, you know, that I'm not, you know, I'm just going to wait for RMA to try to explain. I mean, they do explain it as this data limitation, and you know, and yet I'm still wondering what does that mean and how long does that take to fix, and hopefully we can expand that list so that it doesn't become so that it's just so it's, you know, there's more options for folks. Maybe I'll respond briefly to your answer to Liz's question is that you know, that's what I've been working in this area for a long time, and I started a CSA in my own life many years ago in my attempts at farming, and realized the difficulty. And you know, it's a great way to start, and I know farms that have done it for 30 years, and you know, and continue to do it. But also we're seeing, you know, more and more that people, there's this thing that's called economies of scope. The idea is that we should be trying to get the advantages of of some diversity without having tremendous diversity, and that there are farms now that are providing organic markets, for instance, with some process, like sweet corn and peas. I know in southern Wisconsin there's a long history of growing processing vegetables, and now if they're specialized in organic, again, whole farm could work for some of these farms that have been in these kind of niches and not having the same level of coverage and insurance that has been made available, has been now is available in Iowa. They were probably using Revenue-Lite, for those that are kind of doing 4 or 5 different processing vegetables, for instance.
Jeff, do you know about Sean's question, bees? Is it honey or is it actually bees?
It's honey. It just say bees, but it is actually the value of the honey. It actually, you just put in the, basically you would put in the expected production and value. I was a beekeeper, so if you get a great 100 pounds per hive times the expected value of $1 a pound for the honey, it's $100 of revenue generated by the bees. But no, it's not protecting the bees against, well, it would in a sense protect against the death of the bees, because you would have expected to go 100, but you'd have something that would cause the bee to get hurt, which is the peril side of it, and then you would have the potential production and price effect that would occur as well. So your revenue from bees would be impacted, and therefore indemnity potentially coming from that.
And Jeff, I have a question you may or may not be able to answer. So you mentioned that for other fruits and other vegetables, the premium may be higher than if there was a category commodity for carrots, say, in Iowa. Do you have any idea of how much higher that premium would be? You may have covered that and I missed it.
I'm not quite sure. I know.
Mike, Jeff. Go.
Sorry about that again. Yeah, are you saying, say the question one more time quickly, and I'll try to catch it. I'm not quite sure I got the gist of it.
So this is revenue, and you can put in, any type of fruit or vegetable under other fruit or other vegetable. You would, I assume, put in other vegetables, carrots, other vegetables, kale. And you mentioned that if it's under other, it might have a higher premium.
Right.
Than if it's the main commodity. I wonder if you know how much higher that premium might be.
Yes, it will be higher. It's not a simple answer actually, but it will be higher because essentially, kind of the way the rating works is that they have categories of of crops that are riskier than others, and therefore, when you pick an other crop, that means for sure there's probably a limited amount of information and data, so it automatically will cause the rating to be high. I could have provided it, maybe I'll do this in the following webinar we do, is to show you when you use, say you had carrots on the Iowa list, and I could show you, lumping all the carrots and other things, and then putting the carrots separately, and how the difference in the premiums. But it's not like a simple factor that I could say it's going to be X more. But clearly, as you saw in the Dane County example, where you had the 5 commodities that were on the Wisconsin list, you had an 8-to-1 difference in the price of the premium because everything was lumped in other vegetables. So, and whether that ratio would be the same is not easy to say, because it also depends in the county where you're growing. I could run the exact same farm. Let's say they had all of the crops on the Iowa list that were on the Wisconsin list, and I did a premium for both. There was no guarantee that the premiums would necessarily be the same across Iowa as in Wisconsin, because there's different ratings for different locations. As you can imagine, actuarial science is actually amazing in terms of how they try to factor in location and crops and all of those to assess risk. And it's a very sophisticated system, and it varies. So the premium for for buying corn insurance in Iowa and buying corn insurance in Wisconsin, and certainly buying corn insurance in Montana, where we actually do grow corn, the premiums will be very different because the relative risk of growing them can vary across the location. So it's not, I have a long answer, but it's not, there's no simple X more premium cost. But I would argue that it, generally it will be higher because it's assumed to be riskier.
I figured that would be the case.
I was hoping it would be easier, huh?
Well, Tony or Jeff? Go ahead.
Hello? We lost Liz.
Did you have something else to say?
No, I want to thank you all. As I said, I would just probably end with, we have another webinar planned for this project. That's, one thing I want to do, so I do really want to thank RMA, and it was just me, it felt like I'd be giving a hard time, but they've been very, very good and have worked really hard over the years. I think they, it's always this issue, government and things and bureaucracies, but I mean, we have struggled for a long time to try to come up with something that will work for folks, and it's been improving. I've been doing this 7 years, like I say, almost 8 years, and we've gotten better. It's not perfected yet, for sure, but I think we're moving towards this kind of insurance that I think ultimately maybe lower cost, again, serve diversified. We'll have another webinar. We maybe touch on some topics and do some other examples that we'll again invite you to. I also wanted to let you know again, as I didn't say very well, but was that there's a national webinar sponsored by us, the National Sustainable Agriculture, and an organization called RAFI, Rural Advancement Foundation International, which will be occurring next week, and it'll have more of the same and some of the same stuff happening here, but it's at on the 21st of January at 3 o'clock Eastern Time, and an invitation you could send along to the folks at PFI if they want to learn more. But thanks for having me.
Yeah, we'd be happy to send out any information about that. And thank you, Jeff and Tony. Tony, for really making Jeff work on your different scenarios, and Jeff for all of your knowledge and information, and pushing Tony's questions through to RMA and really getting some critical feedback on that for all of us. So I really appreciate your hard work putting this together. And also Ann Robinson at NCAT, thanks for helping to facilitate. And that's all we have for tonight. Again, this will be archived on the PFI website. And if you have any questions, feel free to email anyone at PFI. You can email me, Liz at practicalfarmers.org. I'll put the chat box here. And also, Jeff, I'm going to answer any of your questions. So, thanks everyone, and have a good night.
Good night.